We're going to wrap up with a very special speaker today. With COVID and everything's happening, we know everyone has been challenged to their limits. And so we wanted to bring in somebody who's really been helping people address this issue. Elena Jensen is an executive coach and principal at eiLumen Corporation. She's certified in brain-based coaching through a Neuro Leadership Institute. She's a graduate of the Intensive Long Applied Compassion Training Program at the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in human resource management. She studied with the former Mayo Clinic wellness champion, Dr. Amit Sood, now executive director of the Global Center for Resiliency and Wellbeing. Elena combines applied neuroscience, positive psychology, and deliberate practice of compassion to help physicians, healthcare leaders, community leaders align their actions to their intentions. Isn't that nice? Align our actions to our intention. She lives in Vermont with her husband, 2 daughters, 2 dogs, and Radar, the oversized cat who must run the house. With this, I turn it over to Elena. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Sappenfield. I'm thrilled to be here. Good afternoon to each of you. And before we start the session, I'd like to make a request that if you can, turn on your cameras because it's actually helpful to me. You don't have to if you can't, but if that's something you're willing to do, that would be very helpful to me. You know, when I was asked to take on this session, I was thrilled at the opportunity to contribute in any way to the important work that you're doing. But I hesitated, and I'll tell you why. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
All right. How about this? I hesitated because of the prospect of the potential of doing harm. And what I mean by that was I was concerned that by having 20 minutes to cover a topic that is just so needed and so foundational that I might have to whittle too much away and it risked falling flat. And it might mislead some of you into thinking that some of the things we're talking about this afternoon aren't for you, that it can't be helpful to you. And that for me would have been doing harm. And it made me hesitate. And I was thinking, you know, oh, I wish, given the work that you're doing and the pandemic and all of the challenges afoot, I wish I could spend hours with each and every one of you and just have an impact and really support you. And then it dawned on me that just because I can't do everything I want to do doesn't mean I do nothing. I can still do something. And that's where it really connected. I imagine that a lot of the stressors that you experience in your work are just that, wanting to do everything for your patients and being so limited by resources, by people, by time, and still committing to doing something, even though you can't do everything. And it really made me appreciate that Linda and Bill reached out to me, knowing that we would only have 20 minutes for this session, but it's still something. And just because you can't do everything doesn't mean you do nothing. So thank you, Linda and Bill. I am committed to making the best use of this time possible. But to do that, I came to the realization, and I hope you won't mind, that we have to be in this together, that I am going to have to pull on you to make this session successful, because I'll do my part. I whittle down some really useful nuggets, some key takeaways, but I can't do it without you. In order for this session to be useful and not just interesting, I need your participation. I need you to lean in. I need you to be there. You will make the difference as to whether or not this information is useful to you or just interesting. It's interesting, but experiencing it will make all of the difference. We learn through experience. Our bodies, our brains learn through experience. And so being willing to walk through some of these exercises that I put in front of you, even though we're remote, will be very meaningful and make all of the difference. So I have to ask for your help. And here's what I'd like to ask is if you can participate, participate fully. I see some of you on my screen. I know that some of you may be in the same room together, that you participate fully. And if you can't participate, give yourself permission to mute me and do what you're doing. If you need to get a report out, if you need to attend to something different, please give yourself permission to do that. This session's being recorded. Come back to it later. And I promise you, this isn't me being a diva or being finicky about my presentation. This is really the best way that I know how to help you take care of yourselves. Give yourself permission to be in one place, doing one thing just for this short period of time. You know, divided attention creates this unnecessary cortisol. It's additional stress and you don't need it. Come back to the session when you have time for it, participate when you can, and it will have the impact that it's intended to have. So without further ado, the setup. And I had the opportunity to hear the lead in to this afternoon and to peek in a little bit. So I know that you each know that you are facing a lot of challenges. There are a lot of stress in your day-to-day work under normal circumstances. And now there's a pandemic, which has such a compounding effect. It's not just the pandemic, it's all of the effects of the pandemic. The supply chain problem, the personnel issues, the political environment. There's so many challenges. And the reason I bring up these challenges isn't because I want to bum you out, you already know about them, is because I have to acknowledge them because we're not going to talk about them this afternoon. I just want to name them and acknowledge that there is a very difficult environment that you're facing. And what we're going to be focused on this afternoon is just you and the impact that you have on you. It's your personal circle of influence. And so it can be distracting to go, yeah, but there's all this other stuff. And so I'm asking you to just go, yes, and. Yes, and there's still an opportunity for impact in our own personal circles. So why talk about this? Why bother these little tiny practices of resiliency when there's just so much wind blowing against us? And you may have heard me say this earlier, just because we can't do everything, because we can't address everything doesn't mean we do nothing. There's still a few things that we can do, and that's what I want to talk to you about this afternoon. So the practice of resiliency is about doing no additional harm, taking care of ourselves so that we don't generate more stressors, so we don't generate more cortisol. It really is very simple. It's just like exercise. It's just a practice. And some of these practices that I'm going to put in front of you are deceivingly simple. You could choose to opt out. It takes as much effort to bypass them as it does to lean in and participate, but they can make all of the difference. And what we're noticing, particularly in healthcare and these studies that are coming out, is that under this really long-term stress, this toxic stress, healthcare workers are having a tendency to shut down, to kind of numb themselves because it's just too much and it's too long. And that numbing process of not feeling actually has us move away from what we need most, which is what we need most right now is connection, to know, and I know, Bill, you mentioned this in your opening talk, that you're not alone, to know that we're in this together. So resiliency practice is really to counter that inclination to turn away and to shut down. And that turning away and shutting down, we're noticing is actually causing long-term impacts, secondary trauma, burnout, depression, post-traumatic stress. So this resiliency work isn't just for the short-term benefit, which it has a lot of, but it's also for the long-term benefit. Doing these practices can actually create kind of this protective coating that prevents a lot of this long-term impact. So not just for you, but for the teams you can bring this back to, it's really important to lean in and see this. So you take care of a vulnerable population, marginalized people, and you do it with warmth and compassion. And resiliency practices is really just taking a little bit of that compassion and that warmth and turning it towards yourself, right? It's just turning it and bringing it onto yourself. So Thich Nhat Hanh, if you're not familiar with this man, incredibly wise man, tells us when you learn how to suffer, you can suffer much less. So that's what we're going to do this afternoon. It doesn't mean you don't suffer. It's just we have the opportunity to suffer much less when we turn and take care of ourselves. So to illustrate that, I'm going to ask you to follow along this little imaginary story. And you may be familiar with some of these stories. You may be familiar with some of these practices, but I'm going to have you imagine a snake, preferably a cartoon snake because it's less triggering. Imagine a cartoon snake slithering along the ground, kind of making his way through a junkyard, and he accidentally nicks himself on a saw that's lying around, and he cuts himself. It hurts. The snake turns, sees the saw, and out of revenge, coils around the saw and begins to squeeze, right? Starts to coil. It hurts, so I coil around you out of vengeance. And what happens when the snake coils, of course, is he cuts himself even more. And the more he gets cut, the tighter he coils. Now, as the objective observers watching this cartoon snake do this to himself, what's the only solution? What's the only possibility for relief for this snake? I'm going to have you say it out loud. You're on mute for the most part. If you're not, that's fine. Say it out loud. What's the only thing this snake can do to make himself feel better?
Let go.
Let go.
Let go. Thank you. And if you haven't said it, say it. Let go. When I work one-on-one with people, there's often a visceral reaction to that, just to let go. And the reason we react to that is because we know what it's like. As human beings, we have a tendency to do that. We get caught up in a feedback loop. If we have an emotional reaction to something, we don't like it, we want to talk about it, we ruminate, we gossip, more energy goes into it. And really, there's only one solution. It's obvious when we're looking at the snake, and we can bring it back to ourselves. And the only thing we can do to make ourselves feel better, counterintuitively, is just to let go, right? So how do we do that? These are the practices we're talking about. How do we learn that when we are in this kind of death grip with this metaphorical saw, how do we learn to let go so we don't do additional harm? Well, it takes practice, but it's possible. It just takes practice. And these are the things that we're talking about this afternoon. And they're deceivingly simple, but the more we do them, the benefit is quick to be realized. The more we do it, the more we want to do it, the easier it gets, and so on and so forth. You know, I love this quote, which is, "The desert works constantly to forbid it, and still the cactus blooms." And so I can bring that to each of your work, which is you are an environment that will forbid kind of this inclination to let go and to allow, but you can still do it. You're still in there. So I'm going to ask each of you, you can use the little icons to raise your hand, or you can just nod. I can see a number of you. Have you ever been in a situation where you're freaking out, you're having a strong emotional reaction, and you notice that you're freaking out? Like you're like, oh, you can hear yourself talk through something going, oh, I'm going to have to clean this up later. Anybody? Just nod if you've experienced that, right? And this is an example of that. You're still in there. It's happening. You're still in there. And when that happens, that opportunity to notice, that's the decision point. That's where the opportunity exists to notice and to let go and to not coil, right? So if you've had that experience, that means you can notice. That means the opportunity is there and we can work with that. So thank you for those of you who've raised your hand. That was helpful for me. So just a brief example to lead us into this practice that I will mention to you is, please, if you can, each of you just take a moment to recall a situation where you were really emotional, or you had a strong reaction, or you're really feeling stressed, like one of those times where you're like, oh, and you kind of feel like, we call it grasping, right? That coiling is like grasping. Sorry about that, just got to pop up. Just bring one of those situations to mind. And with that situation in mind, I'd like for you to look at your screens. And if you can see the words on your screens, look for a word on this list that represents how you might have been feeling. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just identify a word on this list that connects with you, that in that situation that you just chose, you felt this way. I'm going to give you a few moments to find that word. Doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, so hang on to that word. We're going to use it. One of the practices that you may have heard of before, and I will bring back in front of you, or maybe it's your first time, is the practice of naming your emotion. There is neuroscience that proves time and time again in this study, one of the studies that is attached to the last slide, you'll have access to the slide so you can look at it yourselves. There's neuroscience that shows that the process of naming our emotion actually quiets that emotion. Again, it's that opportunity to stop coiling. It calms the emotion and brings us back online. It forces blood flow out of the limbic system, out of our amygdala, calms our amygdala, that survival instinct, right? That fight or flight, and brings blood flow into our prefrontal cortex, our reasonable brain. It calms us. And having done this work for a number of years, I've witnessed it. It's magical when you just ask somebody, how are you feeling right now? And you just watch them come back online, right? It's a little bit of a brain hack, and it can feel really squishy and it might feel patronizing or condescending, but there's science behind here that tells us that is a very effective way to become more reasonable, is to name our emotion, okay? Bonus points is there's studies that show that when we name our emotion out loud, the benefits are even greater. There's something about hearing ourselves name our emotion, hearing our voice, that actually calms that emotion even more. What I like to think about is an emotion is a messenger. Emotions are good. They're what keep us safe. They tell us what we need. And our emotions are like a kid in the classroom going, pick me, pick me. And as soon as we notice that kid and we say, I see you, message received, it quiets that emotion, right? So the practice of naming our emotion out loud calms us. So this is where I'm looking for your buy-in, because we're in this together. I'm going to ask you to just repeat this sentence, thinking back of that situation and that word that you identified to identify your emotion. I just wanted to say, yeah, in that situation, I felt sad, or in that situation, I felt scared. So just please allow yourself to say it out loud. Just, yeah, in that situation, I felt, go ahead and do that.
Situation I felt was strong.
And just notice. Just notice. Okay? Now, there's an additional practice. Once we quiet our brain and we acknowledge that emotion, there's an additional practice that I would like for you to buy. Again, we're in this together, to buy into in a remote setting. And it's this one. I'm going to have you repeat, in that situation, I felt. Okay? Just go ahead and say it again. Okay? And now repeat after me out loud. Of course I felt that way. Of course I felt that way. And you can put your hand on your heart and go, of course I felt that way. And that process actually gives us what we might need in that moment, which is just connection to our shared humanity. Of course I felt that way. The conditions were this. It's this need for understanding, even if it's just self-compassion, even if it's just us understanding ourselves, it has a calming impact. It brings us back. It makes us feel connected. And it's exactly what we need to counter the negative impacts of shutting down and disconnecting. Turning away, we're actually turning towards. So nod if you noticed something, if you felt something when you say, of course I feel this way. Don't give me pity nods. Yes, of course I feel that way. It is very powerful. And it is a magical thing to use with other people, right? So you might be sitting there going, oh, I know who needs this. No, This is for you right now. Adopt the practice, experience the practice, and then you can bring it to other people, right? When we experience it ourselves, we can then translate it over to other people, but just let it sit with you. Okay. And that, of course, I feel this way can bring us back online. It is the break that we might need to bring us back online. And I'm going to talk about that break. I'm noticing something on the chat, so I will. Okay. Yes, feel free to ask questions. Okay, so the last practice I want to mention is founded in neuroscience. I'm going to give you a few bits of information about the brain that we can use into this next practice. Let's see. There we go. So information about the brain, useful hints, useful facts. I'm just moving you over right now. Okay, so our reasonable brain fatigues quite quickly. Does that make sense to you guys? Right? Our reasonable brain fatigues in about 60 to 90 minutes. And when we're on information overload, even quicker than that. We need a break. And if we don't give our brain a break, you know what happens? The law of diminishing returns. We're just not as smart. And the longer we go without a break, the less smart we become. It just is. That's the way it works, okay? A second fact about the brain is that our brains are wired to keep us safe. They scan for threat constantly. That is where we are at baseline. We are scanning for threat. See if this sounds familiar. What did he mean by that? Why did she look at me this way? Why does he want to meet with me? We are scanning for threat. We're looking for what's missing. We're looking for what might go wrong. And that's okay. That's what's kept us safe for years and years and years. But we need to be aware of that because we can get caught in that feedback loop. We can get caught in our thoughts and our emotions, and we start to coil when it's not necessary. We're safe. We're just having these thoughts, and we can just notice them for what they are, right? That's just our brain scanning, and we don't have to be that way. We don't have to be in this negativity bias place. It's just there to keep us safe, okay? So our brain fatigues, we have a negativity bias, and what else? Well, our conscious brain has very limited attention. And this last piece we can use to our advantage, right? Limited attention. So when I turn my attention one way, I'm automatically turning away from something else. We can use that to give our brains the break it needs, right? When I'm constantly in negativity bias, when I'm constantly scanning for threat, to turn away and just look at the good can give me the break that I need. So I'm sharing with you this little drawing, okay? Is it a duck or is it a bunny? Which one? So you'll notice the duck is looking over to the left and the bunny is looking over to the right. They're both there. They're both still there. When you notice the duck, you're just looking at the duck. The change of focus makes all of the difference. And that's the practice I'm talking about. It is completely unnoticeable except of what's going on inside. And so that's the practice of reframing. The opportunity we have to change our perspective, to just let go a little bit and let our brains kind of have a break. And so I'll share with you some opportunities for reframing. It's easy to use 5 ancient wisdoms to give us kind of some place to look, because it's hard to find a way on our own, particularly when we are gripping around that saw, right? Having these little cues can be very helpful. So the 5 ancient wisdoms are gratitude. Sound familiar? We've heard about the practice of gratitude. Gratitude, acceptance, meaning, forgiveness, and of course, my favorite, compassion, right? We can use any one of these. They're not applicable to every situation, but we can use any one of these to change our perspective just for a moment. And this practice is not rose-colored glasses. This practice is not ignore what's going on. This practice is just, give your brain a break. Put the hammer down, shake it out for a minute, and come back online. It makes us more reasonable. It makes us more capable of responding skillfully instead of what we might do, which is react emotionally. I love that term, right? The difference between reacting emotionally, which might sound familiar, and responding skillfully, right? not coiling when we're tempted to coil. So just to illustrate this and to leave you with something to think about, I will give you a very easy example of a situation that was in real life. Just last week, I got a parking ticket. I did everything right. I was helping a friend who needed to talk early in the day. I met him for coffee. He was talking. Clearly, he needed to talk. Our meeting ran long. And because of it, I was late to my next meeting. I ran out of the coffee shop and I had a parking ticket. I did everything right and I got a parking ticket, right? The temptation is no good deed, right? But because I teach this, because I know this, and because I've built these muscles, it was easy for me to go to gratitude for a parking ticket, right? And so I noticed the parking ticket and I went quickly to, well, at least I have a vehicle that they can ticket, right? Because I remember a time where I didn't have a vehicle. And so that didn't change anything. It didn't make my parking ticket go away, but it just stopped that thought process. It stopped that inclination to coil, and it took my mind to something that would fuel it as opposed to drain it. It's just a wise use of energy to kind of stop that thought process, right? So I'll run through the other four, and I know that I'm drawing on my time, right? Acceptance. I got a parking ticket. Acceptance. Well, I was due. I haven't had a parking ticket in years, and God knows I've earned one because I haven't always paid the meter, or I've parked in places where I shouldn't have, right? Meaning is a good one. It's really useful in a lot of situations. Meaning can take you from why is this happening to me to what can I learn from this? What can I learn from this? Well, if my kid was in the car and I got a parking ticket, I would want her to learn that you have to make sure that you park in places where you're allowed. I like to live in society where we have rules and I want to support those rules. So I'm okay with it. Forgiveness, the guy who gave me a ticket, forgave him right away. He's just doing his job. And of course he's going to ticket me. I was right there. And then compassion, in that situation, I chose self-compassion, which is I do a lot of good. I can give myself a little bit of a break. Yep, I got a parking ticket, big whoop. I do all of these other good things. It's okay if I took a hit there. So those are the 5 ancient wisdoms that you can use to kind of realign yourself and cut that thought process, kind of that negativity spiral that might kind of pull us in and get us stuck. Okay, so again, I'm mindful of time. There's information on the slides which you'll have access to. And I'm just asking you, I know we'll do this at the end, to just notice a takeaway. I would consider this a very quick fast food buffet for you. Just notice what connected to you, what might be useful to you, and make note of it. Just to review, we can't do everything, but we can do something. It doesn't mean we do nothing. There's only one solution to coiling, and that's letting go. Naming our emotions disarm them, they quiet them. You got to name it to tame it, right? And saying, of course you feel that way, makes us feel connected, gives us a sense of shared humanity, like Bill said, that we're not in this alone. And reframing just directs my attention to something that might fuel me, that might give me energy, as opposed to draining my energy. Okay, and all of this is dependent on the ability to notice. And if you notice, even if you notice in hindsight, that's the beginning of the work. That's the beginning of building that muscle to be able to use these practices in the moment. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your work. My information is on the last slide. Please reach out to me if you want to tease out any of the information. I'd love to follow. I'd love to have more time. You heard me say this. So if there's anybody who wants to talk a little bit more about this, I encourage you to please reach out to me directly.